You have just listened to words from the Hebrew Scriptures that are very rarely heard. 2 Chronicles 24 is like a remote region of Antarctica. No humans go there except for researchers. I mean, that's kind of an exaggeration, but you get my point. To tell you what I'm talking about, let's do an experiment. I'd like for you, if you're on Facebook or YouTube or Vimeo, I'd like you to go into the comments, the chat there, and type in your favorite Bible story. It doesn't have to be chapter and verse. It could just be Christmas story or David and Goliath or creation story. Okay? So if you've got your keyboard right in front of you, go ahead. And I'll go ahead and type in my favorite Bible story too. We'll do this together. Okay? My favorite story is... Okay, you got it? And if you can't type it in or don't want to, just call your favorite Bible story to mind. Now, I am willing to bet Jim's bank account that no one typed 2 Chronicles 24. Now, I'm not willing to bet my own bank account, but I'm willing to bet Jim's. I'm sure that no one has thought of 2 Chronicles 24 as their favorite. No one typed it in. And if you're trying to get cute to get some money, know that the timestamp is on your comments, okay? But 2 Chronicles 24, it's never cited at funerals or weddings or baptisms. It never comes up in devotionals for inspiration. 2 Chronicles 24 is largely unknown because it goes largely unread and unnoticed. However, 2 Chronicles 24 did capture the attention of one particular rabbi from Nazareth. Did you know that in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, when Jesus is trying to snap some religious leaders out of their hard-heartedness, he preaches to them 2 Chronicles 24, citing a story about the prophet Zechariah. It seems that Jesus found some real power in this very unknown part of the Scriptures. So if you would, follow me into this part of 2 Chronicles. Now, the first thing you need to know about this part of the Hebrew Scriptures is that it takes place in a time in Israel's history that is very, very turbulent. There are big egos making reckless decisions because there's constant political warfare among people with power, and caught in the crossfire, having their lives wrecked, are just normal people. And all the while, there are foreign relationships to foreign powers that are constantly going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, who can imagine such a world? Yeah, it's familiar. Well, this is the setting for our story. 2 Chronicles 24. There is a new king named Ahaziah. Now, here's the thing about this chaos in Israel. It's tragic because it comes only 85 years after the true zenith of Israel's peace and prosperity and influence. I mean, it's just 85 years after the reign of Solomon. And yet, since Solomon's reign has ended, the kingdom of Israel split into two. They constantly fight like siblings. And in the midst of that conflict and chaos, Ahaziah steps into power. Now, Ahaziah is a very unlikely king because he is the youngest of his brothers. Usually, the youngest brother doesn't even get a sniff at the throne. But when Ahaziah was younger, some invaders sweep into Jerusalem and wipe out most of the royal family. The only survivors are Ahaziah. None of his brothers survive. His sister, Jehosheba, survives. And their mother, Athaliah, they're left. Now, Ahaziah's father survives this invasion. He's not there. He soon dies because Elijah curses him and his bowels fall out. But that's a different story for a different Sunday. But when Ahaziah's father does die, there's really no one left in the royal family to assume the throne. And so Ahaziah finally, as the youngest of his brothers, becomes king. Now, here's what's interesting. Guess how long Ahaziah reigned as king of that southern kingdom of Judah? 1 year. The long reign of 1 year. You see, he ends up getting killed because of a coup of a man named Jehu. And right after he dies, we have suddenly a crisis in Judah. We don't know who in the world can now reign as the monarch of this southern kingdom. I mean, Ahaziah has some kids, but they're all infants and toddlers. Remember, all of his brothers that are older than him, they're gone. He has a sister, Jehosheba. She's married to the high priest in the temple, and she has no interest. So who will ascend to Ahaziah's throne now that he's gone? The answer may surprise you. The person who looks at this void of power and steps into it is Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother. Yes, let no one tell you there was no ruling queen in the history of Israel. There was one, Athaliah. She was queen not because of who she was married to. No, she was a ruling queen. She was one who had authority and power to rule over her queendom. It's pretty awesome. So make sure you tell your friends there was a ruling queen in Israel. Well, here's the thing about 2 Chronicles. It does not look favorably upon Athaliah. Now, I have a theory about this. I think that maybe those old historians in a patriarchal time and culture, well, they would have seen Athaliah as problematic even if she was the perfect queen. But regardless of how she was historically, the historians tell the story of a ruthless and violent queen, Athaliah. You see, when Athaliah steps into power and assumes the throne of Judah, she looks at her grandbabies, the babies of her dead son, Ahaziah, and she doesn't see them as children who need to be cared for. No, she sees them as potential threats to her power. And so she gives this decree that all of those children, the children of Ahaziah, they must be executed. Notice the echoes of a Pharaoh in Egypt who sees young Hebrew children as threats to his power. Hear the echoes of Herod, who sees the children of Bethlehem, among whom might be a Messiah. He sees them as a threat to his power, and he orders them to be killed. You can hear echoes of those rulers who try to wage violence against young children perceived as threats. And Athaliah orders Ahaziah's kids to be killed. Well, there is one survivor among Ahaziah's children, one infant boy named Joash. He miraculously is delivered from the wrath of Athaliah by his aunt, Ahaziah's sister, Jehosheba. Jehosheba, who's married to the high priest. Well, they rescue Joash, and they hide him in the temple so that Athaliah does not know that he's there and has survived. And it's in the temple that he is raised under the tutelage of Jehoiada, the high priest. He's rescued, he's taught, he's nurtured, and he grows in secret. Athaliah, who is just next door to the temple, in her palace, on the throne, has no idea that baby Joash is growing into a young man. Well, this happens for 7 years. And on the 7th year, when Joash is 7 years old, Jehoiada, the high priest, decides it is time to bring out this young king. And so on a Sabbath, when everyone is gathered for worship, Jehoiada the high priest makes sure that these clans that he's worked out a pact with show up for Sabbath. They've already pledged their allegiance to Joash. They come for worship, and right on the Sabbath day, in the middle of worship, the high priest Jehoiada brings out his young adopted son, this rescued grandchild from Athaliah, Joash. And as a 7-year-old, there in the temple courts, Jehoiada, the high priest, coronates him as king. This marks the end of Athaliah's ruthless reign and begins the reign of young King Joash. Now, let's just take a pause there, shall we? You might be wondering, how in the world are these stories that are filled with such violence part of our holy scriptures? I mean, there doesn't sound much holiness to them. I mean, it's just a lot of bloodshed and backstabbing, a lot of power changing hands in short periods of time. I mean, this makes Game of Thrones sound tame. So how is this part of what we call Scripture? Well, you need to realize that the Hebrew historians who were collecting these stories in 2nd Chronicles, they're more of theologians than historians. You see, they want to give a portrayal of the chaos of Israel's context. But more than that, they want to try to demonstrate how to trace the activity and presence of God in the chaos. They want to be able to show just where God is showing up in Israel's past, so that generations later can look at the chaos of their own times, and having their eyes trained by Israel's stories, they too can trace the presence and activity of God in their own context. That's the purpose of these histories. So in other words, the historians are trying to show that in the chaos of Ahaziah's reign, in Ataliah's reign, that everyone who's trying to look for the presence and activity of God in that chaos, the historians and theologians of Chronicles are trying to say, it may look like chaos reigns, but actually, God is very much at work secretly and quietly in the temple, nurturing the next chapter of Israel's story. Deliverance is already in motion, but it's just beneath the vision of the public. It's almost like the chroniclers are trying to teach future generations that, yes, maybe when chaos reigns, it may look like God is a no-show, that God's MIA, but don't be surprised if God is very much at work just below your radar, already nurturing the next chapter, a chapter of deliverance, a chapter of a fresh start. Let's go back to our story. 7-year-old Joash, this miraculously delivered child, suddenly becomes the leader of the Hebrew people. Kind of like Moses, when he was, as an infant, miraculously delivered from Pharaoh. He is miraculously delivered to take on a leadership role for the Hebrew people, to begin a new chapter. Kind of like Jesus, this miraculously rescued child is rescued because he has a vocation later in life in which he will start a new chapter for the Hebrew people. So Joash now assumes this vocation of starting a new chapter as a miraculously rescued child, and he begins to fulfill that vocation under the tutelage of the high priest Jehoiada. He starts tearing down the temples of Baal and the altars of Baal that Ataliah was so accustomed to. And he starts this massive kingdom-wide capital campaign to restore the temple to its glory 85 years ago under the reign of Solomon. I mean, he starts to try to center all of Judah's imagination and economic policy and foreign policy in such a way that it is oriented to the very heart of God. You see, Joash is presented as a student of Torah, and he reigns as someone who wants to have his own kingship in sync with the heartbeat of God. And so finally, the people of Judah have a break in the chaos. A new dawn has reigned, and suddenly they can pray to God, not God, deliver us, but God, you have raised up for us a mighty Savior, someone like Joash, who has rescued us from our enemies, from the hands of all who hate us. Your mercy has broken upon us like a fresh dawn. Such is the age of Joash. But you see, this sets up an unimaginable tragedy. You see, when Joash is a grown man, deep into his reign, his father figure, his mentor, the one who helped save him and nurture him, Jehoiada, the high priest, he dies. And when he dies, Joash has a bit of a conversion experience, but not a good kind of conversion experience. Joash, after Jehoiada's death, suddenly turns to God and says, well, God, it's been real. We've had some good times, but it's time for you to go. I've got my own ideas as to who deserves prosperity and justice and who doesn't. God, I've got my own ideas as to who deserves mercy and who doesn't. Now, I've got my own ideas as to just what the people ought to have of a king. I've got my own ideas as to how to increase Judah's power and better our position in the world. I've got my own ideas as to what kind of crimes are just made up crimes and deserve to be ignored, and which kind of crimes aren't esoteric, but the meat and potato kinds of crimes that deserve my wrath. God, it's been real, but run along now. This is a shocking betrayal. I mean, it would be like if Moses, all of a sudden in the wilderness of leading the Israelites to the promised land, finally just gets fed up and says to God, you know what, it's been real, but time for you to go. And he rips open the top of the Ark of the Covenant, takes those tablets, breaks them over his knee, throws down the staff and says, I'm doing my own thing. I've got a new destination. It would be like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying to God and saying, God, I know your will. Your will does not end well for me. So no longer do I want your will, but my will to be done. I want to live. And Jesus storms out of Gethsemane and leads his followers in the dust. I mean, it is that level of betrayal. Joash washes his hands of God and says, I'm doing my own thing. And it unleashes the worst kind of chaos in the kingdom of Judah, the unexpected kind. Now you might ask, well, where do the chroniclers say God is showing up in that kind of tragic situation? Well, the chroniclers have an answer. The chroniclers say that God starts inspiring with the Holy Spirit prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet to come and try to speak some sense into Joash. Prophet after prophet is raised up to go and try to soften Joash's heart, to try to help him rule again according to the Torah as he once did, to try to have a vision of equity and shalom for all people like he once did. And yet time and time again, Joash turns a deaf ear to every prophet and dismisses them. And then finally, Joash is confronted with a prophet that is unique. You see, God plays the ace card here. God inspires with the spirit of prophecy somebody that Joash knows very well. One of Jehoiada's sons, Zechariah. Someone who grew up with Joash around the temple. Someone who would have been a friend to Joash. Someone who shared a father figure in Jehoiada. Zechariah is suddenly filled with the spirit of prophecy, and Zechariah goes to his companion, his friend King Joash, and says to him, you have strayed, brother. You are far from the heart of God, and you need to come back. And Joash, with an absolute cold, brutal heart, looks into this brother of his and orders him to be stoned in the temple courtyard. The same temple courtyard where their father figure Jehoiada crowned Joash as king. It's a story filled with tragic irony. Now, again, you might wonder, how in the world is this helpful? How is turning to these kind of stories helpful? How can I trace God in that kind of turn? I wonder how Jesus traced the presence of God in this story when he cites the story of Zechariah in his own ministry. You know, I think when Jesus looked at 2 Chronicles 24, I think he saw in the posture of Joash, a person who would not listen to the prophets but instead execute them. I think he saw someone like the Herod of his day, who would turn a deaf ear to prophets and even have prophets like John the Baptist killed. I think when Jesus looked at 2 Chronicles 24, he saw a populace who were complicit in Joash's reign by celebrating the prophets who were dead like Moses and yet turning a deaf ear to prophets like Zechariah. And then Jesus looked at the religious leaders of his day and would celebrate prophets of old and yet turn a deaf ear in opposition to prophets like himself. I think Jesus traced the presence and activity of God in 2 Chronicles 24 by showing that God was again and again raising up prophetic voices. Even if they weren't turning the tide of history, even if a revolution of holiness hadn't taken root in the land, still God was active. God's voice was not silent because prophets were being raised up left and right. God's speech would not stop. And Jesus could look around him at John the Baptist, at himself, at their followers, and see that God was still speaking, even if those on the throne would not listen. God's voice would not stop. And so Jesus could see, God is present in our day, just like God was 800 years ago. When he's fighting with these religious leaders towards the end of his ministry in Matthew, he brings up 2 Chronicles 24 and he says, "You loved and love to decorate the graves of prophets, but you sure have a problem hearing the active prophetic voice when it shows up in your time and place. Don't just celebrate prophets like Zechariah, but try to listen and soften your hearts when the same Spirit is raising up voices like Zechariah's today." I've been thinking about how the same kind of thing is true in our own day. I've been thinking of current prophets like John Lewis. John Lewis is a prophet who is quite controversial, but as we've seen images of his funeral, as we've seen images of his casket going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as we've seen images of his casket laying in a place of honor at the Capitol, we have seen so many people in the Senate and in the House and across the country so willing to laud him as a prophet, laud him as an icon of the civil rights movement, and heap praise upon him. But my friends, I wonder if we are very quick to honor him, and yet oppositional to his voice. You want to know what his active voice sounds like today? Let's read. On Thursday, the day of John Lewis's funeral, the New York Times published an op-ed that he wrote and instructed them to publish on the day of his funeral. If you want to know what the words of a prophet sound like today in our context, don't just listen to the praise of the people all around the country. Listen to his voice. This is what he says. "Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said, it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said, each of us has a moral obligation to stand up and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community. a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Can I make an audacious suggestion? When I look at the chaos of our times with a pandemic, with an economy that is crashing, shrinking 33% in the last quarter, when I see that over 150,000 people have died because of COVID-19, and we hear people, Black brothers and sisters who are crying out, saying they cannot breathe because of decades and over a century long, in fact, 400 years long of oppression and violence. In the midst of our chaos, I can trace the presence and activity of God because God is raising up prophets. And I dare think that you are one of those prophets that is being raised up to speak. John Lewis said that it is now our turn to stand up and speak out. It is our turn to act. We cannot witness injustice and just say it'll get better by and by. We have to get in the game, even if it means direct, nonviolent action. And so, my friends, I can see God at work in our chaos because I believe that when you see people in situations that are helping spread the coronavirus by showing up into crowded places with no masks, I believe in my gut that God is inspiring you in your gut to speak up and say, this is not safe. The very least you can do is please wear a mask. I have a feeling that when you hear comments like Black Lives Matter is nothing but an anarchist group, I believe that the Spirit is stirring in your gut to speak up and to speak out and say, no, 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 no. There has been long oppression in a society built on white supremacy. We need to listen to the voices of our brothers and sisters and get in the game so that justice can finally take root in this land. If you want to know what anarchy is, it might look like unidentified federal agents throwing people, peaceful protesters, into unmarked cars. That is tyranny. That is anarchy. If you feel that kind of gut-moving kind of spirit activity, then say something. Do not stay silent. My friends, God is raising up people like us to not stay silent, but speak out. The prophets like John Lewis believed so and is handing the torch to you. And John Lewis also said this: though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. My friends, it is our turn. Let us speak and let us listen to the way God has showed up in our time and in our place. Amen.